Hey everyone, Elia here, and welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. Today we're starting with a new format, one which I hope to do more of. As some of you may know, one of my passions is history, and this episode is a good example, I think, of why that is. Guest host Abdulla Moaswes, a Palestinian scholar and old buddy of mine, is joined by two scholars of Kashmir, Ather Zia and Hafsa Kanjwal, who will introduce themselves in a bit, of course, to talk about, well, Kashmir. It's a long episode, but that's because we wanted to make sure to present Kashmir's history on its own terms. A Kashmir perspective, if you want, that does not center Pakistan and certainly not India, or China for that matter. If you're listening to this on the public feeds, please know that you can already listen to the full episode on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. For as little as $5 a month, you will get access to the entire archive of the From the Periphery Media Collective podcast, including, of course, the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, the From the Periphery podcast, the Mutual Aid podcast, as well as our newly released podcast, Khida, Jewish Counter-Colonial Thoughts, and The Inconvenient Revolution, our podcast on Syria. These are all publicly available. You can search for them on your podcast app right now. But by joining the Patreon, you not only support our projects, which will also soon include a zine, by the way, but you will also occasionally get early access to full episodes like this one. One more thing before starting the episode properly. We are keen on getting audience feedback to better understand what we need to prioritize. If, for example, you would like for there to be more episodes on Kashmir, the best way to do so is by connecting with us via our Patreon. By doing so, you would be able to suggest topics on virtually anything, as well as guests, of course, in addition to the perks that I already mentioned. Okay, so here's the episode. For much of the last 3 decades, Kashmir has been among the most militarized places on Earth, with its territory divided between 3 nuclear-armed states of India, Pakistan, and China. Earlier this year, events in the region acted as a prelude to an armed confrontation between India and Pakistan, which the former used as an opportunity to deeply entrench an emergent settler colonial form of rule in the territory. Many view the Kashmir question as simply a territorial dispute between these 3 states. But as this podcast series will demonstrate, the Kashmir question is one about colonial occupation and anti-colonial resistance. In this podcast series, Hafsa, Ather, and Abdulla first outline the origins of the Kashmir crisis, explaining how the region came to be partitioned as a result of British and Indian colonialism. They contextualize Kashmir's colonization within the project of Indian statebuilding, as well as the territory's relevance to regional geopolitics. In part 2, they discuss Kashmiri resistance over the decades, including the events that led to and comprised the Kashmir Intifada that broke out in the late 1980s. The third and final episode consists of an assessment of Kashmir's current status, and the guests will present us their outlook for the future. So, that's all from me, folks. Here is the episode. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.
No, thank you so much. Given that we've now, I think, established a really good foundation to explain kind of how India comes to colonize Kashmir and to entrench its rule there, I think it's really dangerous to kind of try to not fall into the narrative trap often of not honoring the fact that against colonization, there's always resistance. And so I think it's really important to also point out that, during the period, in fact, the Kashmir issue as we know it today starts with, or at least maybe I'm falling into a trap at this stage, but at least sort of emerges as, one of the outcomes of an attempted uprising, or I think a semi-successful uprising, actually, against the Maharaja in 1947. But often, people think that nothing happens between 1947 or 1949 and the 1990s when what we refer to as the Kashmir Intifada breaks out. But of course, in between that, there are various generations of resistance that also attempt to, address India's occupation and colonization of Kashmir, from the plebiscite front to the National Liberation Front to, eventually the events of the 1980s and the breaking out of the Intifada. And so perhaps I think we should also give space to that, because I think that's a really important, a really important sort of matter to give respect to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely important. And I think it's important to, as you mentioned, that the story does begin with resistance to the Maharaja's rule, especially in those areas that so many people were massacred from. It's also important to note that resistance, or kind of the struggle for self-determination, was active both in Indian occupied Kashmir as well as on the Pakistan side as well. And really, in many ways, the UN resolutions kind of shaped and formed the ways in which Kashmiris would talk about the future. And so, for example, starting in the 1950s and 1960s, you had different plebiscite movements or movements that were calling for the plebiscite to actually take place. And of course, India found different ways to make sure that that would never happen. But these were popular movements. People were arrested, like the kind of legal tactics that Ather was talking about in terms of a set of different laws that, criminalized dissent, positioned all Kashmiris who were speaking for the right to self-determination as just being instigators from Pakistan. All of those weapons that the Indian state uses now, like fully, were already taking shape in the 50s and the 60s. There's also really popular students' protests and different student organizations and mobilizations, especially in the 1960s and 70s, where young Kashmiris were basically on the streets, again, protesting for the right to self-determination, but also articulating the Kashmir liberation struggle in relation to other anti-colonial struggles at the time, including in Algeria, in Palestine, of course, in Vietnam, etc. And so those histories, like Ather said, we are just kind of hearing about them through oral histories. A lot of the documentation, unfortunately, has been destroyed because either like by people themselves because their homes were raided or just taken as people's homes were raided. But these are really, really important histories. And they're important histories especially because Kashmiris have always positioned their struggle as an anti-colonial struggle, even as much of the world has not recognized it as such, given that India was presenting itself as this anti-colonial leader of the non-aligned movement, and also presenting itself as being kind of in solidarity with other liberation struggles around the world. So Kashmir doesn't get talked about like Palestine or Vietnam or other places do in this time because of how India is visualized. And so as a result, Kashmiri resistance is often erased. But I think we're still in that moment where we're trying to uncover a lot of this. What's also interesting is that in the Pakistan administered side is really when you start to see groups like the NLF, Amanullah Khan, of course, Maqbul Butt, who travels from Indian occupied Kashmir to Pakistan to try to raise support for an armed struggle, which at that time Pakistan actually said no to. And so that's where you also begin to get the beginnings of an imagination of independence. So moving beyond just the option of India and Pakistan vis-a-vis this plebiscite that would happen, people start to articulate like actual independent state. And this also becomes popular in the diaspora, especially in the UK, where many people from Pakistan administered Kashmir, especially Mirpur, are displaced in the 1960s. And so their organizations are also talking about some of these themes. And yeah, so there is a rich history of resistance in that time period in between the late 1940s and the late 1980s.
And also the Al Fatah movement. Did you mention that?
No, no, that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, the Al
Yeah,
Fatah
please go ahead.
Yeah, the Al Fatah movement started in 60s itself. Like it was a group of people, and they did announce their arrival by some sort of a bomb blast. But India was very, very successful in repressing it within a decade or so. And then you also see people who were involved in that. They go different ways, and then some of them do kind of like seed what you later on see through JKLF and other offshoots of such thinking.
And that's important because part of the narrative is that resistance only begins in the late 80s, including armed resistance, but there were attempts before. And part of the focus on the late 80s is to also just only link Kashmiri resistance as being a proxy of Pakistan. And I think that's been a really problematic narrative that, again, is like this Indian nationalist or Indian statist narrative where all forms of Kashmiri resistance are just seen as, acting at the behest of Pakistan, where it's actually Kashmiri resistance group who have utilized the resources of the Pakistan state and also have been, disillusioned at times when they felt that the support from Pakistan was not as strong as they would have hoped or expected.
And also the fact that when we talk about Pakistan, we also kind of like fold Azad Kashmir into it because most of the training camps and there still are people who fled or were exiled one way or the other, formally or informally, and they crossed the LOC, which is the line of control that exists in a new nomenclature after 1971 between Azad Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir. And we completely forget about those people who are still residing on the other side and who also supported the movement. And many times it's been that if the militants that came from the LOC, they're easily either referred to as Pakistanis, where they have been Azad Kashmiris. And the other thing is that India also portrays the line of control is a de facto border. That's how it treats it. And there is no international border between the two Kashmirs. So that's something that I just wanted to add. There was something more that I had, it just kind of like escaped me. It was about I think the nomenclature, the line of control, which also is important for us to think with, like what kind of a line is it and what kind of lives do people have around it, and how should Kashmiris think about it? This is the 38th parallel sort of a situation, and it happens overnight in 1947-48, and then in 1971, India and Pakistan get together, and that is after the fall of Dhaka, where they decide that now this is going to become line of control, and suddenly everything changes around it, and that is impacting Kashmiri lives. We often don't talk about people who have been separated for the last 70 years and from 1971 in a different manner. If Kashmiris have to visit, if they ever visit each other, they have to actually go through Delhi. They cannot. There was a brief moment from 2004 onwards, not brief moment, it was quite more than a decade till very recently, but it was so on and off that people did not really trust the trade that was happening between. There was some kind of a soft policy adopted by different governments before, where the LOC was made somewhat porous so that people could travel, and there were demarcated buses that would travel. There was some level of trade also going on, which was basically a barter system because they couldn't decide on which currency to use. But that has all gone out after 2019. So there's a lot happening in that region, which is so obfuscated. And that is also because the focus is so intensely on India and Pakistan and what they do and what they mean for the world. And in that idiom, Kashmiris don't mean much if they don't join one or the other. And I think that's an important question for Kashmiris to think with and what they're doing in this moment. But sadly, not many of them can write, not many of them can speak. Even people in diaspora cannot speak. There are many laws, as I earlier said, that don't allow them to speak. Otherwise, they would lose their lives and properties and jobs, and they have to survive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important to mention, and I'm glad that Maqbool Bhatt also got mentioned because I think when we talk about as well this idea of like the transnational connections, um, I think Palestine is often like the most analogized place to Kashmir. Although I think there are places that are also I think much more in a kind of like academic sense more analogous, like the Western Sahara perhaps. I'm glad that he got mentioned because actually one of the really early mentions of a Palestine Kashmir parallel is actually his conception of the role of Pakistan, right? As Hafsa mentioned, he was not the most popular figure with the Pakistani state, and he actually compares the role of Pakistan in Kashmiri resistance to the role of Jordan in Palestinian resistance during the 1960s. I think that that's super interesting, considering that a lot of people think that the analogy with Palestine really comes out in the 90s with the emergence of the Kashmir Intifada, which I guess that term, kind of comes into play as well really early on in the 90s. And I guess since we're still kind of addressing the question of the role of international actors, before it kind of gets lost from us, I think we should also address the role of China, who also occupy a not insignificant part of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And yeah, I think maybe we should just address that because it's a question that I often get asked, I have to say, when I do talks on Kashmir or talk about Kashmir, is how does China get involved and what is its role?
So I think obviously China is important. The reason why this region is like so disputed over is because India and China are both very like kind of strategic nations. They have been for a long time, for Pakistan as well during the Cold War. And so in the 1960s, one of the things that's interesting is that initially it appeared that the Western powers, like the US, the UK, were in favor of the plebiscite. And so, especially because Pakistan was so closely aligned with US interests in the region as a bulwark against communism, uh, the US was a lot more kind of distant from India initially, and so would also criticize India's policies in Kashmir and the denial of the plebiscite. But then in the 60s, as China kind of becomes a bit more of an important regional actor, the US then kind of strategically shifts and also realizes that it has to have India on good terms as well. And so this is where you kind of see this development of both the US trying to play with Pakistan, but then also playing with India and trying to keep both the relationship with both. And it's because of China. And so China's kind of always in the background, like the way in which different global powers respond to this issue is also somewhat informed by China. And now, what we saw, especially in the past month or so, with China's increasingly close relationship with Pakistan, the fact that Pakistan was obviously using a lot of Chinese weaponry in its battle against India, is that China actually is really significant, right? In that, in some ways, they are able to put some kind of levers on India's complete kind of belligerence in the region, right? India can't be as belligerent as it would perhaps want to be because China kind of checks it from time to time. And yet, at the same time, it's become really important for Pakistan to have this close relationship with China because otherwise they don't have the means to really rival India otherwise. I actually do think China plays an important role. And of course, they also do control a portion of the state that was ceded to them by Pakistan in the 1960s. And so but those parts are largely uninhabitable. But there are skirmishes that also happen along the line of actual control. So there's a line of control between India and Pakistan, or the two, disputes over Kashmir, and then there's a line of actual control with China that there also are these skirmishes around. Sometimes China manages to take territory, as it did in 2021 as well.
Well, I think that's a consummate answer. I just want to say that the region is so full of lines that the listeners will have to do a lot of homework to remember all of them. So, as just to reiterate what Hafsa said, I also don't think that China is just a third party or it's a territorial claimant. It's also a military actor, as we saw very recently. It does have a deep strategic relationship with Pakistan that's based on military and also economics. And it is a regional hegemon, and it does kind of it is giving a lot of pushback to US influence. And that's where India comes in handy. What we saw recently happen was, as Hafsa already talked about, Pakistan cannot be pushed over because it does have Chinese backing. At the same time, China doesn't really militarily present itself just as US does. It does portray itself as a civilizational influence because that's kind of how they see themselves. Whereas India is kind of siding in this moment with US, and US is more of a military power in that sense, an imperial power. So China kind of sees itself differently, maybe because of the civilization and the history that it has had. So it's just in the backdrop, but at the same time, it is doing all the active things it has in the past 5-6 years. Whenever there has been some sort of a negotiation or, not negotiation, some sort of a conversation around Kashmir at the UN level, maybe the side talks, it has made the right noises around self-determination, whatever that means in this moment, because it does have the only two options.
Yeah, thank you. And then I guess returning to talking about resistance, the next thing I wanted to address actually was throughout the period in which we were talking about, from the late 40s up until kind of like the late 80s. Kashmir is not the only region that, India tries to kind of like control forcibly, right? Like there's also regions in the northeast and of course even internally there are also communities that India tries to use a lot of physical and also juridical violence to try and control and domesticate. So I was gonna ask, like, what is the relationship, or what was the relationship rather, of Kashmiri resistance to other resistance movements that were confronting India, or liberation movements, perhaps we could say as well? maybe in terms of the Northeast or in terms of like the anti-caste movements and similar actors?
Yeah, I think it is like you mentioned, where there were conversations that were happening. There were statements, especially in the 90s and maybe different parts of the 2000s, where some of these struggles might express their solidarity or their respect for some of the Kashmiri freedom leaders and movements. Um, but it's not like there was like kind of like, from what I understand, like operational or like strategic planning together in terms of the resistance. I don't think India really like it's just like structurally that would have been really, really difficult to pull off. But I think the solidarities and the sentiments are definitely there. And I think the reason why it is important to mention is that, of course, I don't want to like collapse all of these different struggles together and say that they're exactly the same or they have the same histories. There's a lot of important resonances amongst many of them in terms of, for example, the denial of self-determination in the Northeast, violent annexation of different parts, including, for example, Hyderabad, the counterinsurgency in Punjab, and the use of things like drugs and violence and enforced disappearances there, which are also being used in Kashmir. The fact that there's like AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives the Indian Army like complete impunity from any kind of prosecution for their human rights violations. So there are these like shared tactics for sure, without collapsing them all. But one of the things that I think is important to know is this kind of gets to this question of Brahmanism again, where you do see the same kind of Indian imperial Brahmanical kind of vision for this region overall, the subcontinent overall, that is being enacted. And I do think it's really important to start seeing India. I mean, people are talking about this more so, given what happened in the past couple of weeks, as this regional bully. I mean, India is not just trying to influence or occupy or colonize these various regions, but is also super involved and interferes in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, of course, in Pakistan. And so, like, so much of that is, I think, is built from kind of part of the same mindset that it has towards Kashmir. It really, really sees itself as kind of this imperial force, and that it has to have all of these territories within either its control, direct control, or influence.
Yeah, and that's also reflected in how it has frozen SAARC summits since 2014. SAARC was the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and India used to be big in the strategy around that and also global diplomacy that they were doing through SAARC. What you see from 2014 onwards is that there are no SAARC summits being held, and there's a lot that India is doing, as Hafsa rightly pointed, as a regional bully and kind of sees itself as a global player. And what the recent Indo-Pakistan airstrikes, as they were, which was a military crisis, not a war, that happened in May, the voices that were coming out from South Asia, whether they were from Nepal or Sri Lanka, they were all kind of talking about India in the terms of how it had imposed on them in the last 10, 15 years, and increasingly in the last 1 decade, I want to say. So that does kind of show, and in this moment, really make evident the imperial heart of India that Kashmiris have seen right from 1947, and that also people in Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, have seen right from like AFSPA was in what is known as the northeastern parts, even before it was imposed in Kashmir in 1991. So there were movements around there that people were kind of protesting it for the longest possible time. And there were some activists who are very well known for the longest hunger strike against AFSPA, and then also using rape as a weapon of war. And then we also see the crisis in the heartland of India, which is the Chhattisgarh, and thinking through the idea of the Maoists and the Naxalites. There's so much conflagration inside and on the frontiers of India, and that has already been there for the longest possible time. And in Pakistan is not necessarily responsible for everything, as it likes to. All the ills inside India can be easily, as they diagnose it, as a Pakistani proxy. And in that idiom, Kashmir is not just a Pakistani proxy. And also what India does with Kashmiri movement is it very easily in the global idiom that is so accepted and stereotyped, and it's so overused as Islamic terrorism. And that's very easy for India to do and the world to buy. And I think in that sense, what Kashmiris have for the longest possible time done is that they have tried to create a global idiom for their resistance, in which they've always seen Palestinian struggle as a beacon. And because they've also, for the longest possible time, known that they have been the two first issues on the agenda of United Nations in 1947. So I want to say that Kashmiris, in that sense, they've kind of like always seen this transnational solidarity that happens outside India, whether that be through East Timor or that be through Palestine, and kind of like seeing parallels in their struggle with really struggles for in different parts of the globe rather than within India, because there's a lot of gap between Kashmir and what is the rest of India and how people interact with Kashmir. And now what we see in this moment, there is so much cultural erasure and cultural imperialism happening alongside military occupation and settler colonialism. The way railways, the way infrastructure is being built, so that more and more Indians can be brought inside Kashmir, whether as settlers, and we have evidence that there are colonies being built, that there are different kinds of communities that are going to be established through this new demographic order. But at the same time, just for people to assimilate and these people to come in through tourism. So that's kind of the moment that we are in now. But in the past, there was a chasm between Kashmiris and what the Indian states. So as such, the solidarity that also grew was not directly for the armed struggle as much as it was in the circles of civil society, which did benefit the human rights movement inside Kashmir because it gave a certain space for those kind of conversations. But their solidarity is also very limited because they do not go beyond their nationalistic goals. They kind of like talk about restoring India as a democracy, not having Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which makes India look draconian inside Kashmir. But when it comes to saying that it's not just human rights issues inside Kashmir that need to go away, it's not the AFSPA and laws like it that need to be removed, it's also a political resolution that needs to be brought to people, you do not find them on the same page with you. So the solidarity is very selective, except for a few activists in India. So that kind of solidarity has developed around the human rights issues, but with the caveat that it's not for the political resolution as much as it is to make their nation state look better.
Yeah, and it's great you bring up this issue of transnational solidarity again, because actually I think the next direction I was going to move us into was to actually address a term that I'd been using a little bit throughout this conversation, which is the Kashmir Intifada, which I think is a very important historical moment. I'm sure a lot of listeners will also be sort of intrigued by, the use of the term Kashmir Intifada, especially since it also kind of emerges right after the first Palestinian Intifada. And so I think maybe what we can do now is we can go into, the events of 1987, the rigged election, and then what happens after, and what is actually the phenomenon that does come to be known as the Kashmir Intifada.
Yeah, I mean, I think the timeline that you mentioned is really important, right? That it's happening in the late 1980s, after the first Intifada, but also with what's happening with Soviet leaving Afghanistan as well. And so basically, what you see is 4+ decades of Kashmiris trying to come to this plebiscite or some sort of expression of their self-determination peacefully. It's clearly not working. There is a front that's put together called the Muslim United Front. It was a group of different kind of disparate organizations who came together in this important election in 1987, and they basically, the idea was that they were hoping to win and then kind of resolve Kashmir through this kind of constitutional election process. And that election was massively rigged. In fact, Sheikh Abdullah's son, Farooq Abdullah, was placed as prime minister by the Indian state at that time. And so eventually elements from this formation decided that armed struggle was really the only way to achieve liberation. And so they start doing kind of these, like, again, like kind of smaller scale bombs and attacks, mostly on like government installations or communication lines and things like that. And this is when India really militarizes the region. So it brings in over 700,000 troops. Before, the region again is militarized, but the most of the soldiers are at the border and at kind of these sensitive areas. But now the soldiers are in civilian areas, in neighborhoods, in villages. I think it's really like when I try to explain how militarized Kashmir is to people, and for friends of mine who are not Kashmiri who have visited the region, including Palestinians, they are kind of shocked by the level of militarization. You see an Indian soldier pretty much every like 100, not even 100, maybe like 20, 30, 40 feet. Like they are just everywhere. And so that also means a lot of military convoys, bunkers, checkpoints, that kind of infrastructure that exists. And they're not there to fight the insurgents, obviously. They're there to repress the people and repress the freedom sentiment. And so, alongside this armed insurgency, there's also a mass popular mobilization that erupts. And so people at this time, especially in the 1990s, are taking to the streets, they're protesting, they're demanding azadi or freedom. And the Indian state is responding violently, brutally to even these protests. And so this is a period when there's a series of massacres that happens. They're known, right? They're known based on where they occurred, like the Gaukadal massacre, Bijbehara, Sopor, etc. And so this is a time when many of the rebel fighters basically go across the border, get trained in Azad Kashmir mostly or in Pakistan, and then come back and take on the state. And then, of course, the people continue their popular resistance. So the level of militarization leads to immense human rights violations. Ather's book is on enforced disappearances and the resistance to that, and she can talk a bit more about that and the violence against women in particular, and rape and sexual violence that was used as a weapon of war, but also torture, killings, extrajudicial killings, detentions, like basically everything that you see happening in regions where there is an anti-colonial uprising by the colonial state. And so India draws from that entire kind of repertoire of tactics. Significantly, one of the main tactics that it uses is then to take surrendered militants or people that are in their custody and turn them against their own people. And so it creates these counterinsurgent groups that were called the Ikhwan, and they were extremely brutal. And they basically like positioned themselves as a militant outfit, but then ended up committing a whole host of human rights violations as well, killed many members of the other rebel groups. And so that is one of the ways in which India was really able to kind of clamp down on the armed movement or the Intifada, the Kashmir Intifada. And then starting in the early 2000s, especially with the war on terror, part of then what you also begin to see is how India starts to position Kashmir as another front in this war on terror, and then the armed rebellion as, India's own war against terrorism.
Ather, would you like to say anything?
Yes, I think I probably should. Regarding the Intifada piece, there is from 2008 onwards, like Hafsa spoke, like 2000s were kind of very generative period in Kashmir. In 1996, Sheikh Abdullah's son had been sort of like reinstalled back. And then you kind of see the civil or whatever you want to call it, like the client politics, the local administration kind of coming to fore. It is kind of shown as this electoral success, but it's not just that people want governance. It's almost as if people are endorsing India. That's how India peddles the elections that are held inside Kashmir, which are usually predetermined, which are usually rigged, which are usually people who are endorsed by the Indian government. And the only politics that happens inside Kashmir is pro-India politics. All of the other politics, all of the other kind of activities that people can have is criminalized, basically, right from the get-go. Only the degree is different. So what we see happening in the early 2000s until 2008 is this people's movement, the grassroots movement. So it's a very generative period that is also the part of that intifada, the Kashmiri Intifada, where you have film, you have art, you have writing, you have graffiti. You have murals and everything that kind of shows people's resistance. And part of that is not just slogans for Kashmir, but slogans for Gaza. And Friday is very important for Kashmiri people in that idiom, where they go to congregations, especially to a very famous medieval masjid called the Jama Masjid, where after prayers there's usually protests. And of course, the disproportionate force that the Indian forces and even the local militarized police shows makes it into another thing. It becomes a time of violence where a lot of people are just stone pelting, but they are responding to them with bullets, with different kinds of punishment, beatings, and then also arresting people. And many people in these conflagrations with the police and the army also get killed. So that you kind of see parallels with the Palestinian struggle, and it's during those times where you see the street fighting really reflecting with the Palestinian street fighting. So there's lots of photographs that sometimes got mistaken for, which is Kashmir, but got mistaken for Palestine, but as Palestine as gets mistaken for Kashmir. And that's when you see the circulation of not just how the anti-colonial struggle is happening, but also how the states are behaving. And then you see the resonances with how Israel cracks down on Palestinians in that moment. I'm not talking about the recent genocide in Gaza, but even before, long before. So there's that kind of parallel as well on the other side. Kashmiris have drawn a lot of what I call the affective solidarity that they have for Palestinian struggle, and they have drawn a lot of the emotional sustenance from this struggle to show that they are a genuine struggle as well. Because, in India, for the longest possible time, there was this facade of solidarity with Palestinian struggle. And that came from its own anti-colonial stance, which also was not really a true reflection of what it was doing behind the scenes, which was this diplomacy and arms trade relationship with Israel that it had for the longest possible time. It wasn't just spoken about, and because it was part of the non-aligned movement, and then also it changes hands from one government to another, and they kind of respond differently. So that's also part of the equation. So what you see so many Kashmiris would like to describe the struggle as just like Palestine, because they thought many Indians understood that struggle, but that was not really true for a lot of people inside India. And we see in this moment there is a lot of solidarity for Palestine, but it's not in the same medium that it was before. You see the government behaving very differently, the government being in cahoots with Israeli settler states. And then also are reflective in how it has handled and how it has repressed Kashmiris. So the Intifada of the early 2000s, slowly and steadily after 2008 till 2016, you kind of see it in different iterations. You also see it in 2016 come to forefront as a new form of armed struggle, where you have young militants who are on social media and they're talking to people and they're very clear about what they want. But it's very easy for India to talk about Kashmiri resistance as terrorism. And one of the reasons Kashmiri armed struggle is kind of planted in 1980s is also because it becomes easy for the world to understand it as just like the terrorism that you have in Afghanistan, the easy stereotype, and which also presents this resistance as completely communal, completely based in the Muslim majority. So it's kind of, it has to be like, if Muslims are resistant, it has to be terrorism. So that kind of a thing. But in this moment, what we see is that, so in 2016, I think it was during the bombing of Gaza, I forget the name of that operation. There was a artist who made some art, solidarity art for Palestine, and he was detained. And similar happens in 2016, or even before, when a young boy gets killed trying to protest the Israeli aggression on Gaza at that time in 2014. So you see those resonances with the Palestinian struggle on emotional level, on a visceral level, on the level of anti-colonial struggle, and you also see this adoption of different terminologies and different symbolics, which also shows up in kafaya, which the early the militants or mujahids in Kashmiri struggle have worn. So there's that transnational element in the Intifada, that how it was adopted and how it was kind of how it kind of flourished inside Kashmir till till to this moment after 2019, that they cannot speak. So that's kind of where we are right now. The poetry, the protests, the analysis, the arguments that had become part of Kashmiri analysis and trying to understand what the history is, that has really been in this moment kind of frozen in time. And it's almost like Kashmiris are waiting for something to change so that they can speak.
Yeah, I think that the kind of like reference again to like that transnational solidarity between Kashmir and Palestine is really striking. I mean, the I remember reading in several places of the boy who was killed in 2014 in Kashmir protesting for Palestine. He often was referred to as the first person outside of Palestine to be killed and made into a shaheed, a martyr, during that particular escalation. And so I remember him as that. And I think that that's really interesting. But yes, I mean, the comparison can be limiting in some ways as well. So, for example, like, yeah, when we talk about the difference between the presence of soldiers in Kashmir after the 1990s and in Palestine in the West Bank, I mean, Israel tries very hard after Oslo to kind of like make its occupation invisible in certain places. So it's definitely there, but it's not felt as much. So, for example, like in Ramallah, it would be very strange to see a soldier. But people I know who've been to Ramallah and to Srinagar have often said that, like it's actually really striking that, between each soldier and another soldier, there's another soldier, which is, something that I think just so the listeners kind of like have an idea of like how militarized and how in your face that militarization is in Kashmir. I mean, I think at one point the statistic was that there was one soldier for almost every 16 Kashmiris. Was it something like that?
There was 1 to 8, then there was
One
one
to
to
eight.
and it keeps changing. And in this moment, because we don't have the current numbers from the Indian government, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of obfuscation, but from what the local human rights organizations, they discern and they cull different numbers, the number is around 700,000.
Yeah, and I think that is really striking. Sorry, Hafsa, you were gonna say something.
No, that's all. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, and also I want to say, like, there are these similarities, and I think these are the colonial regimes that are repressing people. So they have to create that infrastructure, and they have to put in place these punitive policies. At the same time, there are differences between the two sides of struggle as to who they are fighting, and also how they are fighting, and what their end goals are for the future of the region as well. So there's lots of but I think the reason the parallels were drawn is because there are a lot of resonances between the two sides, and people have been deriving this. Uh, so there was a time when United Nations was seen as something that was a shorthand for the rest of the world to convey that, oh, we are a genuine struggle. So that's where also the parallels kind of were drawn, because Palestine and Kashmir have been on the agenda side by side as the Palestinian question and the Kashmir question. But later, the Kashmir question gets downgraded to India-Pakistan question or something like that. Early on, when it started, it was the Kashmir question when it was taken to the United Nations by India's first Prime Minister. I also wanted to say, you said that when he was made Prime Minister, I think you meant Chief Minister, Farooq Abdullah. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really important. I mean, I don't mean to say that there's no grounds for analogy. There's a lot of grounds, obviously. And I think also something that's really interesting to point out as well is not just that it's not only Kashmiris actually who had been making that analogy. I mean, even as part of the negotiations and the conversations that eventually led India and Israel to normalize their relationship in the early 90s, there had been, a question of like, how can you help us with Kashmir? There's an interesting like conversation mentioned in Moshe Yeager's book. Moshe Yeager was a really, they used to call him Israel's man in Asia. So he was like the key Israeli diplomat in Asia, and he was sent to India right after was it eight? Eight Israeli tourists were kidnapped in Kashmir. And there's this joint like diplomatic negotiation operation between India and Israel. And at this point, of course, they don't have normal relations, right? To try and secure the release of these tourists. And so, in amongst that, there's an effort from certain elements within the Indian state to create opportunities for a more direct form of negotiation on normalization between the Israeli diplomats who had visited India and the Indian state. And at one point, he gets asked about Israel's ability to build long walls. And so, they say to him, can you help us build a long wall in Kashmir, ostensibly to keep the terrorists out? The grounds for analogy comes from not only those of us who are in struggle against India and Israel, but also between India and Israel themselves. And so I think that's just something really relevant to mention. And this, of course, becomes more and more overt and more prevalent in the years to follow. But I think going back to the 1990s, and I ask this because I'm sure both of you, as myself has as well, get asked this a lot, often in a very interrogative way, but I'm asking it not in a very interrogative way, of course. Is at least whenever I talk about Kashmir on social media, particularly on any public accounts, I often get hit back with, oh, do you know about the pundits? Do you know about what happened to them? Why don't you ever mention them? I think one of the topics we should address probably is what happened in respect to the pundits in the 1990s, and also then how they become politically rendered later on.
Yeah, I can start with a bit of history. The Kashmiri Pandits are mostly upper caste Brahmins. The Kashmir Valley's Hindu minority. In 1947, about 5% of the Kashmir Valley was Pandit. And so even though there haven't been that many Kashmiri Pandits like numerically, but they did play a really important role across these different regional empires, the Dogra rule, and then also the post-colonial Indian state as well. And so they were very close to either during the Dogra period, many of them were the revenue officials, bureaucrats, so on and so forth. And then after 1947, when India basically places these client governments in power, and most of the prime ministers and then later the chief ministers are Kashmiri Muslims. They start to feel anxious, increasingly anxious about their place in Kashmir because they're used to being at the helm of power and they're also used to having access to state resources, including seats in educational institutions and employment and so on and so forth. And so because India and then these respective client regimes are really trying to kind of empower Kashmir's Muslims to see that being under Indian rule is better for them. And also give them like the representation in these institutions based on their actual population and statistics in the state. Kashmiri Pandits start to feel increasingly agitated that they're losing presence. And so there are different moments even before what happens in the early 1990s, including in 1967, where there's an agitation led by Kashmiri Pandits because a Kashmiri Pandit girl had converted to Islam, and married a Kashmiri Muslim man, and the man was accused of like forcibly converting her. And so there are these anxieties that kind of erupt from time to time. Basically, what you have in the early 1990s is a situation where there is this armed struggle, there's this popular mass mobilization. The Kashmiri Pandits start to increasingly fear what this means for them and their future. And there's also a series of targeted killings by the different rebel groups, not just of Kashmiri Pandits, but also Kashmiri Muslim officials who are seen as collaborating with the Indian state. And yet, these attacks or these targeted killings are positioned as anti-Pandit or anti-Hindu, meaning that they are positioned as being religious in nature, which they're not. They weren't. They were targeted towards people who were believed to have been, playing a role for India in the state or in Kashmir. And again, the story of like what happens, how it happens, is very murky. There's kind of a Kashmiri Pandit narrative, those who were actually, those who moved out of Kashmir in this time. And then many of them were, kind of um, increasingly under the influence of a lot of right-wing Hindutva groups in India as well, versus many of the Kashmiri Pandits who remained in Kashmir, and also Kashmiri Muslims who were there and kind of were witness to this as well. In that many of the Kashmiri Pandits who left started to say that they were basically pushed out by their neighbors and their fellow Kashmiris, or that Kashmir became kind of quote unquote radicalized in this time by Pakistan-based groups. And so they had this vision, like an exclusive vision of Kashmir, and that's why they were left. They were basically pushed out of their homes. But other narratives that, people that I've spoken to and interviewed have a very different story, in that they do admit that there was an atmosphere of fear that must have certainly existed, but it was a fear that all Kashmiris faced, given that, the Indian Army was coming in, there were these massacres that were happening. But that many of the Kashmiri Muslims tried to plead with their Kashmiri Pandit neighbors that they shouldn't leave and that they would be protected and that they would keep them safe. But that there was this element of some sort of state intervention or involvement in exacerbating the fear that the Kashmiri Pandits had, and potentially directly or indirectly facilitating their departure from Kashmir. And so this whole incident, though, has been, there's a lot of narratives about what has happened, what did happen. And Kashmiri freedom leaders have always said that Kashmiri Pandits are an integral part of Kashmiri society. They've always welcomed them back, or, said that they should be coming back. They should live amongst their Muslim neighbors, and that there should be an investigation as to what happened that led, over 120,000 of them, a vast majority of them, to leave. Many of them were in refugee camps in Jammu and in different parts of India as well. Then, of course, many shifted to other parts of the world. But basically, some sort of investigation for that, what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits, but also all of these other massacres that occurred in this time. But of course, the Indian government has not allowed or completely rejected that. So yeah, I think Ather may have a bit more to add as well.
What I can add to what Hafsa just said is that in this moment, the Pandits in the Indian idiom, they're kind of made into these civilizational victims. Their suffering is made into something that Muslims have imposed on them, and not just the Muslim combatants, but also non-combatants, civilians, and the Kashmiri society in general. It's always like something happens that Kashmiri society is en masse, they have to apologize for something. So there is a lot of history that Hafsa already talked about, and I would like to reiterate that Kashmiri Pandits were not simply a religious minority or a marginalized minority. They were a robust political class, and it was the Kashmiri Muslims who were marginalized. Whereas that part is also there, where they have been used and weaponized by different monarchs and different ruling powers that we already talked about earlier. And they were entrenched in those courts and in those administrations where they were at the forefront and the face of that particular order. And that history is there. They were always a very influential Brahmin community, even though, of course, there might have been people who might have been disadvantaged as well financially. But they were entrenched in administrative, bureaucratic positions, and they were disproportionately educated. And they were in education and government, in the clerical works, everywhere there was material and symbolic power. They were present. They had economic control. The numerical dominance was there. So Muslim peasantry was largely disenfranchised. So, and then the other thing that Hafsa already talked about, but I just wanted to spell out the Roti agitation in 1931. That was basically a response by them to the recommendations that this British Officer Glancy had made to uplift Kashmiris. And now you might ask, why did the Maharaja want to uplift Muslim Kashmiris? That's another story, because the British had finally decided that they probably wanted to take Kashmir back from him, and he was kind of like trying to make amends. So you have those bits and pieces in early history to kind of see the equation between the Muslims and the Pandits. And it's not that someone overnights the relationship. I always used to think about, like, how can the relationship change overnight? Because I had a few Pandit friends that I was actually waiting for on one day in January, and they didn't turn up. And to me, it's one of my first I want to say, like, first incidents, or maybe one of the array of the first incidents where my political consciousness was kind of peaked. Like, what exactly happened? How is it possible that these people are your friends and then suddenly they leave, and now you come to know that there is this big gap between you and them? And how is it possible that people can leave overnight? There must have been something more, and that is the distance that was already present between the two communities through different eras. And then also the weaponization of these communities once the nation state system is imposed on the already exacerbated relations that they had, even though we also talk about the syncretic culture, but that syncretic culture is also very class-based. That syncretic culture has also a lot of discomfort between the two, which people would never talk about, but which was also like this microaggression that was part of the society. For example, like a Muslim peasant visiting a Pandit household and having a separate cup of tea to drink from. Because they were seen as unclean, or Muslims were seen as the militias. So you have those caste elements as well. So whereas there was some sort of an uneasy truce between the two, and then they had also a shared history because both of them are indigenous to Kashmir, whereas the Muslims who chose to convert or revert to Islam 700-800 years back, because they saw a more egalitarian system to what was then Hinduism and Buddhism, riven with caste, and it was not called Hinduism then. So you have that history as well. So when we think about today, Kashmiri Pandits, rather than presence on Kashmiri land, they're kind of identified by their absence. Even though you still have more than 3,000 people living inside Kashmir, and they're more or less in solidarity with Kashmiri Muslims. So the migration and the displacement that is purely shown through communal lens, as Hafsa already said, is deeply entangled with the questions of their own political allegiance and their entrenchment with state power. And as I said, there is this under-analyzed class and power element that cuts across religious intersections, in which many Muslims are also implicated, and they also had to leave, and they were also persecuted and killed in the initial days when this sorting was kind of done, where the persecution was happening to them who were siding completely with India. So there is a major consensus among scholars right now that while Kashmiri Pandits do have a distinct identity, but the targeting was less for religion and more for their perceived association, whether that was real or imagined, with the Indian state. And as I said, there was a Muslim element to that as well. So the migrations, that is a tragic event, and it has continuing consequences on both communities, but seen as purely Hindu victimhood, and also not, it's now seen as Hindu, but at that time, the word was not majorly used by the community as much as they used the word Pandit that had been bequeathed on them by Mughal rulers long time back for their erudition, for their education. And they were part of the administration as well. So the Hindu victim today, that it's kind of seen as completely based on their religion, is really politically motivated, and it really obscures the structural violence that Indian settler colonialism has brought upon all Kashmiris, and especially Muslims, who were left in that moment to face the massacres that happened one after the other. So you have different readings of what happened and different readings. But I think there is a lot of evidence. There is a lot of, Kashmiris, when they have written about this, they have produced citations for their memory. And I say that from experience, from an edited volume where someone was writing about the grandfather being killed by the Indian forces. And the publishing house said that they couldn't publish that. We had to provide evidence. So we actually gave a citation for that. So so those things are kind of written down, and they have been rigorously researched by Kashmiris and Kashmiri Muslims who were left behind. So in this moment, to kind of think about them as civilizational victims, I feel like that is really at the cost of the Muslim civilian suffering that has happened, and Muslim suffering largely that has happened, which is erased and securitized.
Yeah, and to also add to this, I mean, we also kind of hear the narratives of like a Hindu genocide or Pandit. So there's also this weaponization of this language of genocide to describe what happened. And also this assertion that they are the only indigenous people to Kashmir. So this again links back to that kind of British colonial upper caste Brahmin construction of Kashmir as this Hindu holy land, the indigenous people only being Hindu. Although, as Ather mentioned, like even the Kashmiri version, I mean, what is now seen as Hinduism or Kashmiri Shaivism was actually kind of distinct in terms of like its practices. And again, this idea, which is where I think Zionism, Hindutva, and kind of there are these overlaps that this idea that like a certain group and only one group is indigenous to a land or a place, and that it's also like in this case not even like really ethnically indigenous, which again can be like problematic to begin with because there's a lot of these communities are super mixed. There's been so much movement back and forth, but also that it's defined by a quote unquote religious tradition. And so even if we kind of buy this premise that, or this construction of indigeneity, like, so as soon as Kashmiri Muslims who are like Kashmiri Hindus, right, ethnically or whatnot, as soon as they become Muslim, somehow they lose their indigeneity to the land. Like, so this is, this is kind of the strange things that get trafficked in these constructions.
And the other thing is this new, not really new, but a slogan of right to return of Kashmiri Pandits. It's almost presented as if someone is stopping them from coming. Whereas for the last 30 years, with all the marginalization and the occupation and the dispossession that has happened of Kashmiri Muslims, they have always wanted and welcomed and have explicitly the pro-freedom leaders, and they have had conversations with Pandit leaders so that people can come back and they can begin living as they were. And then there are also different neighborhoods or settlements that have come up where many Pandits have come back. But this right to return slogan is very problematic because it kind of showcases as if someone is stopping them. But I recently wrote something about this, that it's not like the right to return is really, it's kind of like an ironic because they already have the right. They are indigenous to the land. They are part of the land. So the right to return kind of invoking something as if they have been dispossessed and they're not being allowed. And then also connecting Article 370, which the BJP also, I think they connected the right to return and Article 370 as if now the Article 370 was not there. Kashmir did not have the autonomous status, and now the Pandits are free to go back. And I think it was kind of used in that idiom as well. But the fact is they're indigenous to land, both Kashmiri Muslims, even they are both from the same ethnic identity and ethnic background. So in that idiom, they're both the same and they both belong to the land. No doubt, the Kashmiri Pandits do have, a majority of them did have allegiance to the Indian government, so to speak. And that's also part of what became the difference and the gap, the political gap that later on became so big that they had to leave.
So this was the end of part 2. Join us for part 3 and the final part of this series to talk about Kashmir today in the months and years to come. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, it is already available on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. That is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Thank you for listening.